The words that Jody read for us from Paul's letter to the Romans are among the best known words from the book we call the Bible. They've given people hope and life and possibility down through the ages. They're words that we use oftentimes in memorial services, when we need to be reminded that even death itself cannot separate us from God's love. They are also words that I and the Reverend Brandon Johnson, the former associate minister of the church, also used throughout that entire year after New Mexico finally started granting marriage licenses to same-gender persons. We used them to remind the couples who stood before us, who had been in love and living in love for anywhere from 6 months to 56 years, that there was nothing in life nor death, nor government policy, nor church practice that had separated them or could separate them from their experience of God's love with one another. These are powerful words, my friends. Powerful. And if you don't have them memorized yet, I invite you to try to do so. Because they are words that will come back to you in the dark night of the soul. They are words that you can repeat over and again when you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and cannot get back to sleep. Maybe because you have an infant and you're wondering if their crying will ever stop. And if you have the strength to love them to 3 a.m. To be reminded that in your life, nothing can separate you or that child from God's love. There are words that will come back to you at 2 o'clock in the morning after you've come back from the doctor's office and found out something you do not want to find out, either about yourself or about somebody whom you deeply love. There are words that I think probably after reading any headline in today's news, or any day's news, we ought to repeat to ourselves. There is nothing in life, nor death, height, nor depth, things that are, nor things that are to come, powers or principalities, nothing in all creation that can separate us from God's love. These are not lightly spoken words, nor were they lightly written words. As I said in the introduction, Paul most likely pinned these words on whatever piece of papyrus he had at a time when he himself was looking death in the face. He wrote them after more than 20 years, which was a long time in the life of a person in that day and age, after 20 years of trying to get this Christian thing right. He wrote it in the midst of the storms that he had known at sea, the storms he had known in the churches he served, in the storms that he knew in his own life. He wrote these words having buried more than one friend, family member, brother or sister in the faith. And he wrote these words not at the beginning of the faith for him, not when he, like others 20, 25 years, 30 years before, thought the second coming was right around the corner. No, he wrote these words after the long haul, when he couldn't say when Jesus was coming again. But he could still proclaim that in his life and in the lives of that church in Rome, and also in our lives, and in the life of this world, there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. Write those words on your heart. Because, my brothers and sisters, if you haven't already, and my hunch is you already have, or you wouldn't be here this morning, you're going to have a time when you need those words. And the truth of all of this, the truth of Paul's proclamation, comes to us, yes, through the words of Scripture. And my brothers and sisters, they also come to us through the book of creation. And prophets and apostles and women and men of faith have known that for thousands of years. And there's not a one of us, I imagine, in this room who doesn't know that at some level also. More than one of you have shared with me how you have needed to go to national monuments, national parks, state parks, or just wandered around the church grounds in order to reconnect with this one from whom nothing can separate us. Nothing at all. And sometimes we learn that from the book of creation in grand and glorious, powerful ways. Standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon, making it to the top of that mountain, listening for the silence of the desert. Stephen Mather, the founder of the National Park System, knew that truth. A lifelong Episcopalian, he knew the books of the Bible, or as well as Episcopalians do. Some of my best friends are Episcopalian. But he also knew the book of creation. He was a very wealthy businessman at the turn of last century, but he was also someone who lived with debilitating bipolar disorder. And when those episodes came upon him, he had the wherewithal and also the financial means to be able to leave the East Coast where he was living and go out to places like Yosemite and also Sequoia National Monument. But they weren't called Yosemite National Park or Sequoia National Monument at the time. But it was there in that wilderness, in the wilderness of redwoods, in the wilderness of ancient forests, in mountaintops, beautiful meadows, streams, rivers, fountains, waterfalls. Somehow Stephen Mather reconnected with the creator of it all. He found peace and calm that he would never know otherwise. And he didn't leave it with himself. He then proceeded to devote his life and considerable financial resources to developing the national park system of this country, so that all the rest of us, regardless of our economics, can go to places like Yosemite and Yellowstone and Sequoia National Monument and Bears Ears National Monument and Oregon Mountain National Monument, and find the reconnection in those grand and glorious places with the God from whom nothing in life or death can separate us. Sometimes that's how we learn it, in the glory and grandeur of the created order all around us. But sometimes, my brothers and sisters, we read much smaller chapters of God's book of creation. Sometimes only a line. I was reminded of that in the words of Barbara Kingsolver, the novelist, who once wrote that all of us, over and again, time and again, have to rebuild and reconstitute our lives. That when we come to the end of the road, when we come to the dead ends of our lives, we have to relearn life. We have to relearn joy. We have to relearn hope. And she says there is a discipline about that. And it is the discipline, in my words, of the God of small things. She said that time and again she would come back from the depths of despair, from loss, from grief, from all of that, by having the discipline to look not just for the grand and glorious sunrise, but at that geranium, that red geranium flower in the flower pot on the windowsill, or the yellow color of her daughter's dress, or the crescent moon just above the horizon. The God of small things. The God of small things. That reminds us to stay connected to all creation. And I was reminded of that, my brothers and sisters, this past week. As people, friends of this congregation, people like Diana Moya Lujan, Mel Ortega, Pat Griego, wonderful, wonderful Spanish market artists got ready for this weekend. All of those people do straw applique. We have some of their gifts here at the church. Straw applique that looks like this, from Diana Moya Lujan. Can you imagine how many pieces of straw are in this thing? And how much intense concentration it took to develop it? And I've learned both from Monsignor Jerome and also from other artists how it is that this particular art form, unique to northern New Mexico, developed. Because at the time when the Spanish colonists came into northern New Mexico, it was the height of the Empire of Spain. As they came up what became the Camino Real, the Royal Road from Mexico City all the way across those hard deserts, they also brought with them all the trappings of imperial Spain. Jerome likens it to a great tsunami. A great tsunami that just sort of flooded into northern New Mexico. And at the time, in the 1500s and 1600s, with lots of gold, with lots of treasure, with lots of resources. And being Hispanic Catholic, they loved beauty. Jerome consistently reminds me that that is the way to be Christian. Not you Puritans. But they would adorn, initially they adorned their altars, the frames of pictures and all of that with gold and silver. Because it was a way of reminding them, even in the harsh northern New Mexico landscape, of the glory of God. That was in the late 1500s, early 1600s. But then that tsunami withdrew because the fortunes of the Spanish Empire also withdrew. But like a tsunami, when it withdraws, Jerome says there were these pools of communities and of communities of faith all throughout northern New Mexico. Córdoba, Chimayo, all of the various places that we know and love. And they did not have all of the gold and silver anymore. They had to make do and make life and make faith out of the materials at hand. They didn't have bricks or steel coming up from Mexico, so they made adobe bricks from mud and straw. They didn't have steel for plows, so they made the yokes for the oxen out of the wood at hand. And they didn't have gold to glisten and to reflect God's glory, so they found something else. Tiny pieces of everyday straw. Because if you put them on a cross or on a retablo or on a nativity scene just right, they glisten. They glisten, just like gold. And that, my brothers and sisters, became the way in which Hispanic Catholic men and women adorned their churches and their home altars with straw applique. Straw applique that would catch the summer's light and glisten like gold. You can pass these around. It was a way, I believe, that Hispanic brothers and sisters for 300 years kept the faith alive with straw that glistened like gold. But can you imagine how much patience and concentration and discipline it takes to put each one of those little straw pieces on a cross, on an altar, on a retablo? It is like Barbara Kingsolver saying, it takes discipline to relearn joy. It takes discipline to relearn beauty. It takes discipline to be reminded time and again there is nothing in life or death that can separate us from the love of God. Piece by piece by piece by piece of straw used to muck out stables, straw that oxen and horses and donkeys and people would walk on, plain ordinary straw, reminding people of the glory of God, and that even in faraway northern New Mexico, separated by deserts of thousands of miles from Mexico City and by an ocean from the homeland of Spain, that they were not separated from God. Piece of straw by piece of straw by piece of straw. Sometimes, brothers and sisters, the book of creation blares out, nothing can separate us from the love of God. New Mexico sunrises and sunsets and Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and a glory and blaze of color and life. But sometimes, my brothers and sisters, the book of creation comes to us in that individual piece of straw that captures the light and captures the glory of God, and reminds us time and again that indeed there is nothing in life, nor death, height, nor depth, powers, nor principalities, things that are, nor things that are to come, nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God, the God of small things. Thanks be to God. Amen.